"Pack your things, we're going home," the cowboy said, after seeing a widow and her kids eating scraps. The church bell had just stopped ringing when the cowboy stepped out of the feed store and caught sight of the widow and her children crouched beside the stone steps, picking through a paper-wrapped bundle of scraps like they were sorting treasure from ash. The youngest boy licking a crust of bread that had fallen in the dirt without saying a word. The mother, thin, mid-30s, hair pulled back in a knot that couldn't hide the exhaustion in her face, tore her piece in half before putting it to her mouth, eyes darting toward the chapel doors, as if even being seen there might offend someone righteous. No one else looked. The preacher stood in the shade, sipping coffee with the mayor, and the shopkeeper swept his stoop without missing a stroke. But the cowboy didn't move. He stood there with his hat still low from the sun, dust on his boots, and something hard tightening behind his ribs that had nothing to do with hunger. He watched the oldest girl, maybe 10, hold out her piece of food to her brother and whisper, "You eat it." And that was enough. He crossed the road slow, spurs silent on packed dirt, and stopped just beside the widow without speaking. She looked up like a woman ready to be shamed and braced for it, but all he said was, "Where's home?" Her mouth worked like she wasn't sure what language he meant. "Nowhere," she finally whispered. "Used to be west of Dry Fork. House burned last winter. We've been walking since March." He didn't nod, didn't frown, just looked at the children, hollow-eyed, silent, each one more bone than boy. Then he knelt, slow, until he was eye level with the middle child, and said, "You like beans?" The boy blinked. "Real ones. Hot ones," the cowboy said. He stood again, took a step back, then said the words like he was reading them off a fence post meant only for her. "Pack your things. We're going home." The widow stared at him like he'd cussed in the sanctuary. "We don't have things," she whispered. He tipped his hat. "Then it won't take long." And just like that, he turned and walked back toward his horse, not waiting for thanks or questions or tears. He didn't look back as he swung into the saddle and pointed east down the trail toward a ranch no one had lived in for years. But behind him, the widow gathered her children in the scrap bundle, standing like a woman who didn't know if she'd just been rescued or roped into something stranger. Either way, she followed. The cabin he took them to wasn't much. One room, a rusted stove, roof patched with mismatched shingles, and a door that creaked like it was warning anyone foolish enough to knock. But to the widow and her 3 children, it looked like a palace, and none of them said a word as he opened it with a boot and stepped aside, like it had always been theirs. Inside, the air was dry and cold, dust thick on the table. But there were 3 plates still stacked from whoever left before the war took half the county. And the cowboy set them down one by one, then looked to the widow. "Ain't got bread yet, but there's beans in the bag, and I reckon I can shoot us some meat before sundown." She stood there with the baby on her hip and 2 children at her sides, not knowing whether to sit or wait for orders. And it wasn't until the smallest one, a boy with no shoes, whispered, "Mama, can we stay?" that she blinked hard and answered, "Just for tonight." The cowboy didn't argue. He took off his coat, hung it on a nail, and moved toward the woodpile without another word. "What's your name?" she asked finally, her voice dry from disuse. He stopped at the door, turned his head just enough. "Creed. Call me Creed." She nodded, then sat slowly at the edge of the bench, one hand resting on the table like she needed to feel something solid. "I'm Annie," she said. "They're Josie, Eli, and Ruth." Creed nodded once, then stepped out into the wind. The girl, Josie, opened a drawer and found an old spoon, held it like it was gold, and smiled. "It's not broken," she said. And for the first time, Annie let herself smile too. She fed the kids what little was left in their bundle, and then boiled water for beans, and by the time Creed returned with a hair slung over his shoulder and snow caught in his beard, the cabin smelled like life. He handed her the rabbit without ceremony and said, "This place is yours now." Annie didn't answer right away. She just reached for the knife and started skinning it like she'd done it 1,000 times, the kids watching with wide, hungry eyes. That night, they ate quietly. No prayer, no stories, just chewing and heat and a silence that didn't feel hollow. Creed slept by the door, rifle beside him, boots still on. Annie curled up on the floor with her children and whispered, "Don't forget this. This is what safe feels like." And in the dark, no one argued. They woke to wind the next morning, not sharp enough to bite, but cold enough to remind you that winter had only softened its grip, not released it. And Annie stirred first, pulling the threadbare blanket higher over Ruth, while Josie still snored against her shoulder. Creed was already gone. Not the horse, just the man. Boots missing, rifle gone, coat taken. But a pot of hot water sat on the stove, and a single note carved into a scrap of pine that said, "Back before noon." For a second, the old fear twisted through her. What if this had been charity with a clock on it? What if she'd just taught her children that hope comes for one night and leaves with the sun? But then the door creaked open, and Creed stepped in. Mud on his boots, 2 strips of salted pork in one hand and a box of shells in the other. "Storekeep owed me," he muttered, setting the food down without explanation. "Didn't argue when I said you had 4 mouths to feed." Annie blinked. "You told him they were yours?" "Told him the truth," Creed said. "Told him you'd feed him with or without me, and I'd rather not have to shoot him for standing in the way." She didn't know what to say to that, whether it was a kindness or a threat or both. But the kids had already grabbed onto his coat like he was a tree trunk in a river. And that afternoon, without asking, he hitched the wagon and pulled the widow and her children toward the trading post. "I can walk," Annie said, halfway to protesting. "Don't need charity." Creed didn't look at her, just handed the reins over. "Ain't charity, it's purpose. You ride, I walk." "You walk, I argue," she shot back. He looked at her then, not smiling exactly, but something close to it. "Then we both ride." And just like that, she climbed up, pulled Ruth into her lap, and let the old mare carry them through pine-shadowed paths, while Creed rode beside, eyes scanning everything like the world owed him violence, and he wasn't about to get caught surprised. At the post, folks stared. Nobody asked who she was, but they looked at her like she didn't belong. Until Creed stepped behind her with a burlap sack of flour and said loud enough to turn heads, "Put it on my account. The woman's feeding my house." And with those words, she stopped being a shadow and became something else entirely. Someone claimed. On the way back, Josie asked if they were going to get a dog too, and Creed chuckled once, low in his throat, and said, "Only if it eats scraps polite like you." The girl laughed. And behind her mother's eyes, something warm and dangerous began to flicker. By the 3rd morning, the cabin no longer smelled like dust. It smelled like smoke and eggs and something almost like home. And while the wind still slipped through the wall slats and the floor creaked in every step, the sound of children breathing in their sleep had become a kind of music that made Annie's hands move without dread. She'd risen before Creed that day, gathering kindling with Josie while Eli tried to chop wood using a stick too short for the job and too dull to do damage. When Creed stepped outside, bareheaded and carrying the rifle out of habit, he stopped at the sight of them. Not because they were doing anything wrong, but because they were doing it without needing him. Annie was kneeling by the woodpile, sleeves rolled, cheeks flushed from wind, and he watched for a long second before setting the rifle down and saying, "Chickens came back." "We have chickens?" she asked, half turning. He nodded. "Old hens from the last tenant. Been roosting in the trees. I baited 'em with beans. They wandered back to the coop like they never left." "What else you got hiding out here?" she asked, and this time there was a smile tucked in the corner of her mouth that hadn't shown itself since long before her husband died. "Old ghosts," Creed muttered, "and one mule I don't trust." That night they ate eggs and cornmeal, and something like laughter rose from the table when Ruth threw a crust at Eli, and Creed deadpanned, "If you throw again, you marry the mule." Even Annie laughed then, real, cracked but whole. And when she went to wash the tin plates by the creek after supper, Creed followed with the lantern and stood beside her in silence. "You always live alone?" she asked softly. "Didn't plan it," he replied. "Just kept leaving places until nobody followed." She handed him a wet plate. "Well, we're here now." He didn't answer, but his fingers brushed hers as he took the dish. And something electric passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but a recognition that comes only when two people see each other not as burden, but as answer. "You gonna run?" she asked. "Not tonight," he said. They stood like that until the cold finally pushed them back inside. And that night, after the kids were asleep, Creed added another log to the fire before stretching out on the floor with his coat for a blanket. He didn't ask for thanks. Annie didn't offer any, but she tucked an extra quilt over him before blowing out the lantern, and when their hands brushed again in the dark, neither of them pulled away. The snow came back that week, slow and heavy, cloaking the hills in silence and locking the trail to town under drifts too deep for wagons. And though the cabin stayed warm with the stove burning low and the hens now laying regular, something in Eli changed. At first it was small. He wouldn't touch his portion of beans, just pushed them around the tin plate like they might bite him back. Annie noticed first, of course, and tried to coax him with bread dipped in broth, even with a sugared root she'd hidden from Ruth. But he only shook his head and turned away. Lips tight, eyes darker than usual. Creed watched in silence for 2 days before finally setting his cup down with a quiet thud and asking the boy straight, "What's eating you, son?" Eli didn't answer. Annie started to speak, but Creed held up a hand. "Let him talk." The boy's voice came low and broken. "If I eat too much, you'll send us back. That's how it worked last time." The room froze. Annie looked down at her hands like they'd betrayed her. Creed leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Who sent you back?" "Mama's sister," Eli muttered. "Took us in for a week, then said too many mouths, and I was the one who ate the most. We left the next morning." Annie's eyes brimmed, but she stayed quiet. Creed didn't flinch, didn't sigh, just looked the boy dead in the eye and said, "This ain't charity, Eli. This is life. And life means you eat, and you grow, and you stop looking over your shoulder every time someone hands you a plate." Eli's chin trembled. "What if you change your mind?" "Then I wasn't worth the beans in the first place," Creed said simply. He stood, walked to the stove, scooped a second helping, and set it in front of the boy without ceremony. "You eat, you stay. That's the law here." The room was quiet except for the pop of pine wood catching fire. Eli looked at the plate, then up at Creed, then back at the food, and finally, slowly, began to eat. Annie turned away before her tears spilled. Creed said nothing more. But later that night, when the fire burned low and the children were asleep, Annie stood beside him by the door and whispered, "No one's ever talked to him like that." Creed looked out at the falling snow. No one ever needed to. And as the wind howled across the ridge and their shadows flickered on the cabin wall, she reached for his arm, not to hold him, but to steady herself, as if her own foundation had just shifted. The snow cleared just long enough for Creed to take the wagon into town, a run they couldn't delay any longer. Flour was low, the youngest had a cough that needed herbs, and the chickens weren't laying as often in the cold. Annie offered to ride with him, but he shook his head. "You stay. Fire's got more work than I do." She didn't push, just handed him a cloth sack with a list scratched in charcoal and said, "Come back with more than just beans." He gave a rare half-smile and rode out before dawn, the rutted trail cutting through thawed mud and wind-hardened drifts. But by the time he hit the trading post, something in the air felt off. The town was too quiet. One of the windows had been boarded up since the storm, and the old smith's forge was cold. When Creed stepped into the store, he saw why. Harvey Heller, the rancher who'd once courted Annie's sister, who never married and never stopped holding grudges, stood at the counter, a new six-shooter on his hip and a ledger in hand like he belonged behind the register. "You buying for yourself or for her?" Heller asked before Creed said a word. Creed didn't blink. "Didn't know I needed permission to feed a family." "That family don't belong to you," Heller said, stepping forward, voice tight. "Word is, you've been keeping the widow and her bastards out at the old Grant place like you're setting up a ranch of misfits." Creed kept his hand near the fold of his coat where the Colt sat holstered. "They're fed. They're warm. That's more than you ever gave 'em." "A man's got the right to know who's eating off his county," Heller snapped, hand twitching near the butt of his pistol. Creed moved first, just a step, but enough. "Try it," he said quietly. "But make sure you draw clean, 'cause if I'm still breathing after your first shot, you ain't getting a second." Heller hesitated. Behind the counter, the shopkeep, a thin, pale boy no older than Josie, froze in place, unsure who'd fire first. The silence felt like it might collapse the roof. Then Creed reached into his coat slow and set $2 on the counter. "That buys what's on the list. You can keep the questions." He turned and walked out, never letting his back turn fully to the rancher. By the time he reached the wagon, the tremble in his hand was gone. But he didn't ride home slow. He rode like a man who knew trouble had just started following his trail, and who'd be damned if it reached the cabin before he did. The wind had picked up again by the time Creed reached the cabin, the wagon's wheels groaning through wet ruts as snow curled across the hills like ghost smoke. And Annie was waiting on the porch with Ruth bundled in her arms, her hair tied back tight and her face set like someone braced for bad news. He didn't speak when he climbed down, just handed her the flour, the herbs, and the pouch of sugar he hadn't mentioned. And when she opened it, her eyes filled before she could hide it. "You all right?" she asked, voice thin. "Not a scratch," Creed said. "But there's men talking. Heller's stirring something." "What kind of something?" "The kind that smells like fire before it starts." She looked past him toward the trail. "We can pack. Be gone by dawn." He stepped in close then, his voice low but firm. "You're under my roof now." The words weren't soft, but they weren't hard either. They were built like the cabin. Rough, real, meant to hold. Ain't no one running unless I say so, and I ain't said so. Josie came out then, arms full of kindling, and Creed nodded toward the door. Get inside. Keep the stove hot. Annie didn't move, not yet. You can't fight a town, she said. I don't need to, Creed replied. Just need 'em to know they can't scare what's already been broken and rebuilt. She watched him for a long moment, then stepped aside so he could carry in the sack. That night, supper was quiet but warm. The sugar stirred into the cornmeal porridge like a secret. And after the kids were asleep, Annie sat across from Creed at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of steeped pine and her eyes no longer wary. Why do this? She asked. You owe us nothing. Creed looked at the fire, the shadows moving across the floor like passing storms. 'Cause I had a father once who took in a woman with 3 kids and no name, and I watched him build a family out of what the world threw away. Did it work? She asked. Creed smiled without showing teeth. I'm sitting here, ain't I? And in that moment, something settled between them. Not love, not yet, but foundation. The kind you pour slow and steady so it doesn't crack in spring. He stood, grabbed his coat, and paused by the door. Lock it behind me, just in case. Where you going? Nowhere far, just making sure nobody's watching from the ridge. Annie nodded. And as the fire hissed softly behind her and the wind tapped the glass like a warning, she whispered to herself, You're under his roof now. And for once, the words didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like shelter. The blizzard came hard and sudden, howling out of the northern gulch like it had been waiting for the right night to strike. And by sundown the wind was tearing at the roof shingles, snow burying the steps, and the lantern light inside the cabin flickering like it wasn't sure it would last till morning. Creed had sealed the windows with flour sacks and patched the stovepipe just in time. But the real danger came after dark, when a horse whinnied from the edge of the woods, and Ruth stirred in her sleep, and Annie crossed the room with a mother's instinct and said, He's not alone. Creed was already lacing his boots. He grabbed the rifle from behind the door and slid the bolt slow and deliberate, every motion quiet enough not to wake the kids. Heller? She asked. Maybe, Creed said. Maybe just a man dumb enough to freeze for a grudge. She touched his arm. Don't go out. Ain't out I'm going. I'm waiting right here. He stepped to the edge of the window and peeked through the edge of the cloth nailed to the frame. 1 figure, then 2, then a third farther back, barely visible through the snow, each one holding still like hunters waiting for a deer to flinch. Creed didn't fire. He opened the door and stepped into the storm. Rifle raised but voice calm. You want to fight? Make it honest, he shouted into the white swirl. But don't think I won't send you home with less men than you came with. Silence. Then a voice answered. Low, slurred, but clear enough. She ain't yours, Creed. Ain't your kids neither. You're right, he called back. But that never mattered. A shot cracked from the ridge, missing by feet but close enough to stir smoke off the stovepipe. Creed dropped flat, rolled, and fired once, clean and low. One scream, the others scattered. For 5 minutes he waited, breath steaming, snow crusting his shoulders like ice from another world. Then he stepped back inside, closed the door, and bolted it without a word. Annie stood by the table, Ruth clinging to her leg, Josie holding a kitchen knife like it might be enough. It's done, Creed said. For tonight. She set the knife down with shaking fingers, crossed to him, and pressed her forehead against his chest. You keep risking your life for us, she whispered. What if one day you don't come back through that door? Creed didn't answer right away. He just laid a hand on her head and said, "Then you light the fire anyway." And she knew he meant it, not as goodbye, but as a law. When the thaw came in late March, it didn't announce itself with flowers or birdsong, just the slow drip of melting snow from the porch roof and the first sound of creek water trickling free after months of silence. Creed spent the better part of a week rebuilding the fence that bordered the east pasture. A task no one asked him to do, but one. He undertook with quiet focus, sleeves rolled, hands blistered from smoothing splintered rails that had collapsed under winter's weight. Annie watched him from the cabin window between chores, one child strapped to her back and another sweeping mud out the door. And something about the way he moved, shoulders steady, boots sunk deep in thawing earth, felt like permanence. On the 6th day, he hammered a final post into place and disappeared behind the tool shed. When he returned, he carried a wooden plank, freshly sanded, the letters carved in with a blade and darkened with soot. He mounted it on the gate before dusk, his jaw set like a man bracing for judgment. Annie stepped outside once the supper was off the stove, wiping her hands on her apron, eyes narrowing as she approached. The children followed, Eli first, Ruth close behind, all of them quiet. The sign read, A. Walker Ranch. No frills, no claim of ownership, just her name. Annie stared at it for a long time, the wind brushing her braid over one shoulder, her voice caught somewhere between breath and memory. "You did this without asking," she finally said. "Didn't figure you needed my permission to be seen," Creed answered. "Didn't put my name on it, just yours." "Ours," she corrected, the word so soft it almost vanished. Creed looked at her then, not like a man needing thanks, but like a man who'd waited years for someone to say the word out loud. "Ain't no judge in this county gonna sign a paper for us," he said. "Not with your name, your past, and 3 mouths not born of my blood." Annie stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "Good thing I never needed paper to know what home felt like." He didn't kiss her, not then. Just took her hand in his and held it there while the children watched, unafraid. And the sun dipped behind the pines like it had been waiting for this moment all winter. The fence stood strong now. The name stood prouder. And for the first time in a long, long while, Annie Walker felt like no one could take either away. Spring came slow but certain, unfolding across the hills in waves of pale green and soft brown. And by the time the last frost left the ridge, the porch was finished, 6 planks wide, 3 steps down, railings smoothed by Creed's calloused hands and stained with oil the color of coffee. He built it not because anyone asked, but because Annie once said the cabin didn't feel real without a place to sit between chores, a place to rest without guilt, to shell peas or watch the sky or let Ruth nap in the sun. And so he built it. Each board nailed without hurry, each post measured by eye. And when it was done, he dragged 2 chairs from the barn and set them side by side. Their backs turned to the trail, as if to say, "We're not waiting for anyone now." Annie came out just after supper, the light soft on her shoulders, apron dusted with flour, and sat beside him like she'd always belonged there. The kids were inside, drawing in the dirt with sticks, and for the first time in memory, the quiet didn't ask for anything. "I used to think I'd never stop moving," she said, voice gentle. "Like if I sat still, everything I lost would catch up to me." Creed didn't reply right away. He was carving something into the arm of the chair, her initials she saw, small and deliberate. "Sometimes the only way to outrun the past," he said, "is to give it somewhere to sit down and rest too." She reached for his hand and didn't let go. You still sleep with your boots on? Only when ghosts are walking, he said. How many ghosts out here now? She asked. He looked at the sky. Less than before. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the porch rails. And inside the cabin, a baby's giggle rose clear and unafraid. Annie closed her eyes and let it fill her. You think this is what it's like to belong? She asked. Creed nodded slowly. Reckon it's the only kind I ever wanted. They didn't need a preacher. They didn't need a paper. They had chairs and bread and fence posts, with her name carved clean. And as the wind curled around them like a whisper of everything they'd lost and everything they still might find, Annie leaned her head on his shoulder, and Creed said quietly, We're home. If this story touched your heart, ride with us again. Like, share, and subscribe. And visit the channel for more long cinematic westerns that honor mercy, grit, and love born in the dust.